That would be a point to shoot down, though, if you can.
In other words, if go back to verse 5, where the king didn't have, it's out of his hands, left Jeremiah in the hands of the princes, and put Jonathan's house. The only way the king could keep him out of it would be for Jeremiah to make his statement that that's what he was pleading about. Not necessarily he was withholding information because he'd already told that to the people.
Mm-hmm.
But would that justify it if they hadn't talked about it?
Mm-hmm. All right, let me make an advanced statement. I would say that verses 4 and 5 are very ambiguous. The officials have to come to the king to ask for the death sentence. Now, if they really have all this power, which the king can't oppose according to verse 5, why do they come to the king in the first place? And by ambiguous, I mean, who really has the power here? Could not that king's second statement there, the king can do nothing to oppose you, is simply flattery to keep these guys on his side? Because times are rough right now, the city is going to fall. If it's not flattery, and it's the literal truth, the king can do nothing to oppose you, then why didn't they just execute Jeremiah and lynch the king meanwhile? See, it would be my understanding of verses 4 and 5 that the king is still the one in control. And he wants to keep the officials on his side. The less divided the city in these final moments of their war against the Babylonians, the better, the king thinks, as far as he and the people are concerned. That he might have, selfish motives behind that all. Jeremiah might have the same thought. The less divided, the better. Just for the not for anything spiritual, but just for the natural outcome of everything. Jeremiah might have other motives himself involved. And therefore, I would read verses 4 and 5 to see that the officials have no authority apart from the king. The king is the one he listens to the officials. Sometimes he does what they ask him to do, like throw Jeremiah in the pit or something, to appease them and keep them on his side. But yet, they do come to him, and so he flatters them. Well, he is in your hands. The king can do nothing to oppose you. Well, the king certainly could. If he's still king, you've got to have someone who's on your side working for you. And why couldn't he get his thugs or his bodyguards to go do some damage to these officials if he really doesn't like these officials? Okay, anything else we need to thresh out here?
In other words, that more or less destroys somewhat Jeremiah's withholding what he said or what he didn't say to the officials there.
It could, in a sense.
One thing is evident that there seems to be opposition between the officials and the king.
Seems to be.
And so I don't know how his reasoning is in a sense that he doesn't want the officials to know something, but it appears that fall in line with the fact that maybe the officials will misinterpret him talking to Jeremiah, and that he might be
That may be.
lack of trust in one another. So that
He's saying we ought to raise the question, why does the king want to withhold this information from them? And his statement would be, he's not withholding any information because they already know that information. And so then his response would be, well, it's not the information so much, it's that the king appears to be in cahoots with Jeremiah. And the officials just hate Jeremiah. And the king, he's got ambivalent feelings toward Jeremiah. He likes him. He knows he's a prophet of God. He wouldn't be going to him and asking him, do you have a word from the Lord? Notice the officials never go to Jeremiah and say, do you have a word from the Lord? They hate Jeremiah. The king doesn't hate Jeremiah. There's some type of friendship, although I'm sure it's ambivalent, between the king and Jeremiah. And there's an ambivalent friendship between the king and the officials. And there's no friendship between Jeremiah and the officials.
Okay, a parallel there between him and here would be that the officials are obviously asking Jeremiah for something that relates between the king and the official, and not something that's to do with Jeremiah.
Okay.
And if he only answers, as far as his concern and not the king's concern, obviously he's deceiving them to think that they didn't talk about anything that would concern the king and the officials.
So it involves a second and a third party with Jeremiah, with the king, and with the officials. But whereas with Abraham and Sarah, it involves a first and second party. The first party being Abram and Sarai together, but particularly Abraham, because they're together and all of that, and Pharaoh and Abimelech would be that second party. You do cut one party out, though. You don't have and that would almost dilute any thought of Jeremiah being afraid for his own life, because what this battle is between is the king and the officials, not with Jeremiah and his life, but between the king and the officials.
This could be substantial too, since they all know what Jeremiah's prediction is. They may think, since the king called Jeremiah, they may think the king will submit to Babylon, and the officials obviously don't want to do that because that's the result, because the king follows along with the suppressing, that's what they talk about.
That could be.
That's why verse 5, it sounds like he's trying to make the officials think that he's afraid of them.
So it appears that he does follow.
And see, if we've already seen the king and Jeremiah to be somewhat of friends, the king, Zedekiah, has had many opportunities to kill Jeremiah before. He could any time he wants to, and he never has. And if our view of verses 4 and 5 is correct, the officials don't really have the power to kill or execute Jeremiah apart from going before the king. And that means no one can kill Jeremiah. That means how is he afraid for his life? Because no one's going to kill him. And yet, both of those threats are given right here. Verses 24 and 25. It doesn't really appear like anybody could kill Jeremiah. The king won't and the officials can't. Because if the king won't and the officials want to, they would have to go to the king who won't. Has anybody swapped sides since we've been going in this? Everybody on the same side? You swapped over to this side. You think. She's gone to this side. You swap sides? You were on this side. If we can assume they talked about both matters, she will go over here. Would you?
No, I don't think so.
I wouldn't want to assume
I think I'd still stick there at this point because when the officials question him, he makes it sound like all they talked about would be he didn't want to go back to Johnson's house. And it's obvious the officials wanted information to do with, Babylonian captivity or whatever. It's obvious they wanted to know if that's what they wanted to know what the king asked them, what the king wanted to know.
But they didn't question them farther.
So we're digging now to the root of how far can you go in this whole business. I mean, we have never said, I was going to say we never have said the opposite, but I'll tell you the positive side. We have said that it's perfectly legitimate to tell part of the truth and withhold part of the truth, right? That's perfectly legitimate. And you would think under the circumstances that you're not led to deceive the other person in some fashion. And so we're digging deeper on that one thing right there. How deep can we go and how far can we go in that area? These people are seeing that he told part of the story. I guess they're assuming that they talked about this, telling part of the story but withholding part. And yet somehow they're not seeing that as deception because of other things involved.
I guess just thinking about this more with Abraham and Jeremiah, what you said, who benefited the most from what Jeremiah said? Was it Zedekiah or Jeremiah? Whereas with Abraham, who benefited the most when he said, "She is my sister"? It was Abraham who benefited the most from that. Whereas here, I think my gathering, it was Zedekiah who was more beneficial in what Jeremiah said, because from Jeremiah's previous character, he never withheld information in the past that would have been harmful to his life.
Okay, that's a valid point. It's like this number 4. Zedekiah is the one who has something to gain or lose and not Jeremiah. So since Jeremiah doesn't have anything to gain or lose for himself, I don't know that he's going to be lying to protect some unregenerate king. I mean, Abraham very clearly is afraid for his own life. And we still have not established the point conclusively here that Jeremiah is afraid of anything. These people are giving us many reasons here to believe why he's not afraid for his life. And I've tried to help them point some of those out. The king's not going to kill him. The officials can't. We have sarcastic statements in verse 15. Zedekiah thinks whatever he wants to in verse 16. And where Abram is clearly concerned about his own skin, Jeremiah has something else more basic and more non-selfish involved here, and it's not his own hide. This has been a very, very good discussion. I'm very proud of everyone. You're thinking very well. And we're going deeper. So you got to have someone to keep you in the right track. You're going deeper in this thing now.
Well, I didn't form an opinion from the beginning because I didn't have a chance to really look at it thoroughly. And since I'm listening and looking and reading here, the only thing I can see in chapter 38 is two things that the king asked Jeremiah, and that was, first of all, to give him counsel from the Lord. And then the other thing down in verse 26, the king commanded Jeremiah to the officials ask him what the king had said to him, was to tell him that he was pleading with the king not to send him back to Jonathan's house to die there. He didn't want the officials, if Jeremiah would have told the officials what he had told the king, then the officials would come back pleading with the king again and kill Jeremiah for giving him, tell him these negative things about what's going to happen in Israel.
So what side does that put you on here then?
And then in verse 27, then it says that it says Jeremiah, when Jeremiah was questioned, it says he told them everything that the king had ordered him to say. And the only thing that it says in chapter 38 that the king ordered him to say was that he tell him that the king told him that he was not send him back to Jonathan's house. He was to die there, which was a lie. So I'm saying that what Jeremiah told the officials was a lie. Because the only thing that says that the king commanded him to say
Was verse 26.
verse 26.
And we can't assume that that really happened. We can't assume they really talked about that in the conversation, verse 26.
No, because
Okay.
it says, that is totally
That's-
from the whole conversation.
Okay, that's number 6 here. That the king just made that up.
Right.
Just made it up to give Jeremiah something to feed these guys
Right.
whenever they came. And that's been your point.
I have changed sides over to the did not lie.
You're on the did not. Oh, we got two converts.
On the basis of when you go back to 37:20, where Jeremiah met with King Zedekiah earlier, and he had treated with him there, not to send him back to Jonathan's house.
Okay.
And then when you go down into 38, he's telling the people again what's going to happen to them. So he's telling them, in essence, he's telling them exactly what he's telling King Zedekiah in 38. So the people have already been told
Okay.
what was going to happen. So
Okay.
he wasn't withholding any more information from them. And he already had pleaded for not to be sent back to Jonathan's house.
Ah.
Maybe in an earlier conversation, but he still had been asked not to send back to Jonathan's house.
Okay, now 2 points are being made here. One has already been made. I think one's a new point. The first point that's already been made is that he is not withholding anything. He has said this about Babylon over and over and over and over again. He's not withholding anything. They would argue just because that was the immediate conversation of the king. Of course, you'd still ask, why did he withhold since he's told it before? And we've tried to explain what they would say to that response. But still, they already know that. So you're not withholding something from someone when you've already told it to them 14 times before. And the second point she's making, which would really have to be a number 10, is, and she wants to get into this Jonathan house thing. And you might could even take her point a step further, but let me just give what she gave. She says that he's been thrown into Jonathan's house, twice before. And he has made at least one recorded plea in chapter 37. What verse? Verse 20. To be brought out or not to be cast back into Jonathan's house. So what he's telling here is the truth, but he's talking about an earlier conversation that he's had with the king. That's basically what she said. Or you could take her point a step further, which would make all the sense in the world. Since he asked the king in their last conversation not to be thrown into the house of Jonathan, who's to say they didn't talk about the same matter here again, but it's just not recorded here? And of course that would go down here to assume that they did talk about Jonathan's house. So I just put Jay's house, if you remember that point.
We can respond to that.
All right.
The fact that Jeremiah comes to the king for two reasons. He comes either to plead not to go to Jonathan's house or to give him counsel. And that the king, not wanting, in a sense, the king, there is this opposition. The officials threw Jeremiah into the cistern. King brought him out. Why bring him out? I mean, he wanted to, the whole thing is that he's seeking counsel of the Lord from Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't, and that counsel is, everyone knows what the counsel is, but he doesn't want to make it appear that way, that he may follow the fact that we know that they actually do both have mutual interests. They don't want to give in to the Babylonians, but it appears as if he's seeking, but Zedekiah is wavering. It appears as if he's seeking counsel from Jeremiah, then he might follow it. And so
Okay, if I'm hearing you correctly, then there's nothing wrong with this being thrown into Jonathan's house. That could have happened or not have happened. It doesn't make any difference whether the people knew what they talked about before or not. Just the fact him not telling what they talked about, there's no lie involved there. They already know that. What's involved here is this whole talk between Zedekiah and Jeremiah, as though in the eyes of the official, that's going to alienate them from the king or the king from them, because somehow that puts the king over on Jeremiah's side, and that's what the officials don't want. And so again we come back down to the thing that Jeremiah is not concerned for himself at all. The only one he ends up protecting is the king. If I can listen to arguments well, this fear thing has been destroyed by these people over here.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid for his own life, you can see that.
Okay.
I'm on the light side, I never thought he was afraid for his own life. But then I found the verse that says that he is, about two of them. No, Jeremiah.
Well, I think that verse in
Yeah,
chapter
because
30.
over in 37.
Okay, 37.
Yes, verse 20 says, "Don't send me back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, but I will die there." And in chapter 39, verse 17 and 18, God is talking to him, and he says, "But I will rescue you on that day, declares the Lord, and you will not be handed over to those you fear. I will save you, and you will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life because you trust in me, declares the Lord." So he was afraid of dying in Jonathan's thing, but that, I don't think, is his motivation behind it.
Okay, hold your horses here. We got 2 points that she's trying to make here. So even if she goes with the fear people over here, that's not going to change her mind, because that's not what motivates him anyway. We could all be afraid of something. That's not motivating him to do something that's wrong.
Afraid to not obey God.
Okay. All right, let's answer these 2 verses that she's brought up, though. 37, what was that again? 20. Do not, now my lord the king, please listen. Let me bring my petition before thee. Do not send me back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, or I will die there. I think it could be very well argued that still we don't have any fear involved. He's not afraid. It's just a matter of fact. I don't want to die. I mean, fear of death is one thing, and the fact that I'd rather keep on living is another thing. Then in chapter 39, verses 15 to 18, I think the subject of the fear is Ebed-Melech. and not Jeremiah. If you read the whole section there, Jeremiah gives him a prophecy. He's taught God speaking through Jeremiah to Ebed-Melech. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says, I'm about to fulfill my words against this city, but don't worry, I won't let anything that you feared come upon you. So instead of God talking to Jeremiah, he'd be talking to Ebed-Melech. Yes?
Okay, but now, to go back the deception here now, some more. If you look,
I think he's the only one left on this side over here. Well, we can expect his wife to be deceived by him.
Says that King Zedekiah sent for Jeremiah. All right? And if the implication in verse 27 is that Jeremiah went to the king to plead about not being sent back to Jonathan's house.
Okay. What's the punchline?
Well, he's
That's
he's
fear.
deceiving them. Well, I would get fear back out of that because he doesn't want to go back to Jonathan's house, and he knows that if he tells what he just said, that's where he's going to go, because that's what the king said. He said, if you're going to tell anybody, then I'm going to kill you.
Okay, but still, does that mean anything about fear? You might not want to go somewhere.
Well, even if the fear isn't in
Okay.
he's deceiving the officials to make them believe that he went to the king to plead not to go back to Jonathan.
Okay, we could say that, but I think what we're going to have to say is Jeremiah is not afraid for his life. We're not ending up with that anywhere here. We don't have anywhere here any hint that he's afraid of his life. That has to be read into all these passages here. You could say yourself, I don't want to go over there. You know that you're going to, I don't want to take this job. You know that you're really going to get a bad deal here. It's not that you're afraid. You know what fear is? Fear is a certain type of emotion. It's not that you're afraid. It's just that, matter of fact, I don't want to take it. Just common sense. This is a statement of fact. I don't want to take it. I'm not afraid to take it. I don't want to take it. And so my whole point in this fear bit, because that seems to be obvious as an implication here when you're just surface reading the passage. My point about that is to contrast it between Jeremiah and Abraham. Abram was clearly afraid of his own life. And that's the only only reason why I've been stressing this fear. I do not think that you could ever find fear for Jeremiah's life here in these couple of chapters. Not in the sense that Abraham was afraid. Abraham was afraid of his life, and because of that one fact alone, he worked out this strategy to deceive other people. Jeremiah might have a certain strategy here, but I don't know that it's done on the basis of fear, though. He's got some type of strategy involved, but he's not afraid for his life. I don't know who had it up first.
Well, doesn't Jeremiah's strategy involve, the whole thing is he wants Jerusalem to give up to the Babylonians. And he knows that the officials are in opposition to this. That's the reason that they were trying to kill him, and the officials were trying to kill him. And so he thinks if he can keep off the officials, maybe, in following the strategy of the king by lying, in a sense, that we're saying, that in that way, he can see the Lord's will being done in the situation.
But you'd have to add to that and say he can see that maybe then the king would somehow surrender the city.
Yeah, that's what he wants happening. He wants the king to surrender the city. He doesn't. So it's allowing, in a sense, the king to stay where he is and not to have the officials who are wanting to give a fight.
Uh-huh.
But the king already said that he wouldn't do it, though. For the information, right?
What's that?
The king would not surrender the city. That's
He
why.
does.
Right?
That's it.
At that point, the king is already saying he would not surrender the city.
Where does it say that?
Well, he says that to tell, at least to tell Jeremiah to be quiet. We have to assume that that's in his heart.
Well.
Okay. We'll probably get back to that here in a moment. Over here.
Doesn't the oath of King Lord lives, He has given us breath.
Oh, I don't know you can base a lot on the us, but he may be sympathetic with Jeremiah. You know, I think we've talked about an ambivalent, friendly relationship between them. He may be sympathetic with Jeremiah for selfish reasons, though. He wants to get a word from God that said, yea, I shall never leave my covenant people, and yea, the Babylonians shall not overcome you. We know that because he's gone and said, do you have a word before? It's a friendship, but it's a selfishly based friendship. He believes that Jeremiah is a prophet from God, and these other guys want him thrown to the lions. Well, are we ready for me to help you develop some of this then? Because this has been very well done. That's what makes you think. You won't ever forget this Jeremiah, and you'll remember all the different angles. This is the way I have to study things and prepare things, is look at all these angles. And we don't always have time. Looky here, we're way over an hour already to do it publicly, but it shows you got some commentators that are over here, such as John Calvin, and you got some that are over here, and you see all of their points right here, and yet both options can't be true. You either have to pick this one, or say we just don't have enough information to be definitely sure what happened. But even if that's true, I know that a lie is still not justified. See, it still wouldn't affect your interpretation of morality, though. And that's one thing that biblical commentators sometimes seem to forget. They want to prove this a certain way, or at least prove it to be a stalemate, so that it's all right to do what Jeremiah did. But that's not necessarily a valid conclusion, though. Okay. I'm obviously on this side over here, or if it's not obviously, I am on this side over here. I don't think he was afraid. This reward, that wouldn't really count as a reason. I do think a lot has to do with the fact that Zedekiah is afraid. I think a lot of his previous character, he's been in the ministry for a few decades now, and he's really proven himself in his moral uprightness and not being afraid. All right, there were a couple of really big points here. Oh, I think it would be these here. These are my biggest points, 8, 9, and 10. See how long it took you to get to those, though. You have to work your way through this. Assume that they did talk about it. That's my assumption. Otherwise, Jeremiah's obviously telling a direct lie. And so you say, well, how do you know that he's not? Well, again, I'd have to go back here to previous character. He just doesn't seem to me to be the type that would lie in a situation like this. Since the king said, tell them that you were pleading to me about not going back to Jonathan's house, since as has been pointed out in 37 and verse 20, he pled that the last time. It's to be understood that perhaps, no one could say definitely, just on that basis, perhaps he did plead the same thing before the king again. The only way I think that you could say definite is that Jeremiah did indeed plead that. And I don't feel that Jeremiah was wrong in what he did. To me, that would mean that they did talk about Jonathan's house. This already new business, he's not withholding any information from the people. They already know all of that information, and it's not going to do them any good. And we'll see how that fits under one of our sub-clarifications here in a moment. And, okay, this was same as 8, except this was that they had talked about it earlier, Jonathan's house. They had talked about it earlier. And this was just assumed that they talked about it. But she was the first one to actually point out in chapter 37, this was talked about earlier. So you could easily reconstruct that situation right into from chapter 37 right into chapter 38 and have him pleading the same thing. Okay, listen as I read along here and see if you can catch the flavor of what's going on. And that's why I interpret it on the right-hand side. This chapter of Jeremiah records events toward the very end of the lengthy Babylonian siege of the city of Jerusalem. The city falls in the next chapter. Tensions are running high due to the scarcity of provisions and the evident certainty of the city's outcome, with even the officials being able to, you can read the signs of the sky, the city's going to fall. They've been under siege for months now. You're going to fall. Politically speaking, the atmosphere was one of hopeless despair. And inasmuch as Jeremiah's constant voice rang clearly on the side of ultimate Babylonian victory, he did not exactly curry the favor of the Jewish bureaucracy. Thus, he was the man picked out to be picked on.
for the continuation of this
Thus, he was the man picked out to be picked on. His being thrown into the pit in chapter 38 was not his first taste of the no love lost principle. He was placed here by the hand of the princes, but with the consent of the king, verses 4 through 6. Ebed-melech the Cushite rescued him, and then King Zedekiah called him for another private conference, verse 14. See also chapter 37 and verse 17. At this juncture we must include the caution which the king suggests to Jeremiah, for it is at this point of Jeremiah's compliance that scholars part company in their interpretation of this speech. Some seeing faithful obedience to God and the king, others noting fear expressed through falsehood. Then I quote from the King James Version, Jeremiah 38, 24 to 26. Was Jeremiah at fault for his action? May his action be placed in the category of those of Abram? Did his concern for his life engender a momentary casting aside of the purity of simple honesty? Most conservative scholars answer no. A footnote number 10, Charles Feinberg. He is a representative of this group. However, though he lists 8 points for Jeremiah's acquittal, I personally do not see the need for all of them. Jeremiah, Commentary, Grand Rapids, Zondervan Publishing House, 1982, page 264. Calvin, on the other hand, is an example of the sparsely populated conservative camp, who responds affirmatively that he did lie. I said sparsely. There are not too many commentators on that side, Calvin being one of them. But such is the typical nature of Calvin's eximious zeal of honest forthrightness, a zeal which could easily have been predicted in this case by any attentive student of his voluminous commentary writings. Calvin Commentaries, Volume 10, pages 419 to 420. And here I quote John Calvin. It was not indeed a falsehood, but this evasion cannot be wholly excused. See, he's a little ambivalent. It wasn't false, but it can't be wholly excused. Well, that must mean it's partially false then. But Calvin wasn't willing to say that because he thought he saw that Jeremiah also was innocent. Though the prophet did not expressly or in so many words say what was false, yet it was a kind of falsehood. He could not by this evasion be wholly exempted from blame. He says that he did as the king commanded him, but he ought rather to have hearkened to God's word, in which simplicity is enjoined. In response to this position, 3 thoughts are offered. First, what Jeremiah said, parentheses, as phrased by the king, verse 26, and evidently stated by Jeremiah, verse 27, and then see chapter 37 and verse 20, was undoubtedly true. In an earlier account, in chapter 37 and verse 20, he said these very words, that is, in verse 26, I was pleading with the king not to send me back to Jonathan's house to die there. Pleaded these very words, and there's no difficulty believing they were repeated when his persecutions were repeated. When his persecutions were renewed, there's no difficulty in thinking that he would have used the same sentence so that he didn't have to go back to the same place again. In addition, chapter 38, verses 15 to 16, implies this much for the present account without our looking to the previous chapter, which is what we've been discussing before. Secondly, these officials had no right to question either Jeremiah or the king because they had absolutely no jurisdiction either over the king or over God's prophet. With Abram, the case was somewhat different, for he was a subordinate responding to a higher authority figure. Mere nobodies, I mean by that these officials, are not worthy of the truth, nor a lie to be sure. For who would be so foolish as to tell all to an enemy spy just because Christianity is based upon truth? Some have said that Jeremiah sinned after Abram's example of the fear of death, but his 42-year ministry had more than proven his love for God over his clinging to earthly existence. And besides this, only the king had power over his life, not the princes. See verse 4 of chapter 38. The Apostle Paul later commanded that we obey the higher powers, and such was King Zedekiah, Romans 13:1. Finally, we see that Jeremiah tells of the first part of the conversation, verses 15 to 16, which is where we'd probably put this business about Jonathan, while passing over the rest, verses 17 through 23. It is this latter omission that has caused a problem in Calvin's opinion, and in most of your opinions as well, or some of your opinions as well. Yes, Jeremiah failed to relate the entire conversation, but that is because the second part would have been useless. Now remember, that was the one thing we said. You don't always have to tell all the truth. You can tell part of the truth, leave the rest of it out. Then we ask ourselves the question, under what circumstances may you leave the rest of it out? I said when it's useless, when it's not necessary. So you would have to argue on that basis to fit this into our understanding of the half-truth, that it was useless, all right? Why was it useless? Useless from the point of view of these men. See, I think other things are undercurrenting here, and I think some of you have seen these things and pointed them out, such as this relationship between Jeremiah and the king, and we're not told all the ins and outs of what their relationship is, what Jeremiah's concern is for the king, and so forth. But I think that we're told enough to give us a good hint so that we could say the following. Why should Jeremiah be bound to inform the princes, men who were outraged, men whose death was imminent, men who were in no frame of mind to listen to reason, of information, the queries of Zedekiah and Jeremiah's response, which was useless to them? You see, in their state of mind, it was totally useless. They were outraged. Their mind was made up. It doesn't matter if Jeremiah had what he said about the king. These princes have their mind made up about Jeremiah. They have their mind made up about the king. They have their mind made up about the Babylonians. They have their mind made up about the war that's going on and everything. They do not intend to surrender. And it's just going to egg the matter on, as they say, for Jeremiah to deliver his prophecy for the umpteenth time, yea, ye shall be delivered into the hand of the Babylonians. He's not withholding something. He's told it many times before. He simply sees that as being useless to talk about anymore. It's just unnecessary. It may unnecessarily cost him his life. Not that he's afraid of his life, but why lose your life unnecessarily? If you're going to lose it for a necessary cause. And this is unnecessary. The city's going to fall the next chapter. Furthermore, this material, verses 17 through 23, has been prophesied time and again in Jeremiah's ministry publicly, and the princes were in no mood to hear this dirge again. Even if the issue concerned only him, which it did not because of King Zedekiah, it is by no means certain that he was unjustified in his course of action. When all the evidence is weighed, and we've done a good job of it here, it appears that the case is quite different from Abram's discussed earlier. All right, that's where I would put the case because of a lot of these last reasons we looked at here. He's really not tricking the princes. He's really not tricking them. It's useless information to them. It has been said over and over. Starting back in chapter 25, he prophesied 70 years in Babylonian captivity. Now we're way over to 38. He said it again and again and again. These men are hot-headed. Tensions are running high. The food is so scarce, they're eating their own children now. Who wants to hear that prophecy again? Jeremiah thinks that it's just unnecessary at this time. He's not afraid to deliver it. If God said deliver it, he'd deliver it for the 94th time. But it's not necessary anymore. The city falls within a matter of days. Therefore, I don't see any way that Jeremiah has done anything wrong here. But we see how difficult some of these cases can be. And I don't think this is the most difficult one in Scripture. I think it's the second most difficult one in Scripture. And there's one over in 1 Samuel 16 that I think that's more difficult. Okay, are we through enough with that? Very good arguments. Very good. We need two parties in here. So even if you believe this side, just play like you believe the other side. But those are very good arguments. That's exactly the way people have thought it ended up on this position. And see, when you do something like this, you're able to appreciate their point of view better. You're able to appreciate all these points here, but you think that you've got valid answers for them. And someone who's on this side is able to appreciate this person's point of view. I don't have any problem condemning Jeremiah. I mean, Abraham was a great man of God and he sinned. Maybe Jeremiah did here too. But I'd have to have a little more proof before I'm going to find him guilty. But Calvin is always looking for holiness and truth and simplicity so much that he sees a fault here in Jeremiah that I don't necessarily think is to be found here.